Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 125, The Girl Next Door. War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. Teasing, taunting, poking fun, and tormenting were all words used by those who knew 16-year-old Jennifer Parks to describe the endless bullying she endured in middle school by her next-door neighbor. We often hear of killer kids who allege bullying at school, but this week on Murderous Minors, we look at the murder of Jennifer, whom prosecutors contended was ultimately bullied to death. Randolph, New Jersey, 60 miles west of New York City, had only had one murder over the previous decade. This episode contains descriptions of bullying and the gruesome, ghastly murder of a teenage girl, so please be advised. An across-the-street neighbor recalled Jennifer as a, quote, wholesome, big-hearted, and quiet teenager whom he trusted enough to babysit his two small children. Others remembered how she liked to ride her bike and dance in the rain and could still imagine her jumping on her backyard trampoline and splashing around in her above-ground pool in their mind's eye. She kept to herself and was known to hang out in the school newspaper office, behaviors which caused some classmates to tease her for being different or for always having a book in her hand. The only child was a computer whiz and a lover of Harry Potter. According to her mother's later testimony, her daughter didn't have many friends, had ADD and took special education classes in school, but also wrote short stories, was active at church, and was preparing to begin her sophomore year at Randolph High School, reportedly relieved because the brother of her bully from middle school was starting to be her friend. 2 years before her death, Jennifer and one of the boys who lived next door to her on Old Brookside Road had issues because 12-year-old James Zarate had reportedly mercilessly teased and bullied her. He was said to have called her names based on her appearance, and it got so bad that they had to be split up from classes at school. He was ultimately prosecuted for criminal mischief for throwing a brick through the window of Jennifer's mother's Ford Taurus in May 2003. Zarate had to pay restitution and was sentenced to community service for the vandalism, and then went to live with his mother in Garfield, New Jersey. In the more than 2 years following the car window incident, Jennifer seemed to be moving on, even talking about her bullying at a school assembly in the 8th grade. Jennifer had also slowly begun to tell those in her life that she'd made up with the Zarates next door, and that she'd even had Jonathan over to swim in her beloved backyard pool. Her family home on Old Brookside Road had belonged to her grandparents, and her father and his siblings had grown up there. That Friday night had been ordinary, according to the Zarate brothers' father, who would describe how his 18-year-old son Jonathan Zarate was fine when he got a haircut, shave, and a new suit that night. Jonathan would say later that a few hours after, in the early morning hours of Saturday, July 30th, 2005, he messaged his next-door neighbor Jennifer and asked her to come over and watch some TV in the basement where he slept. Jonathan had quit Rutherford High School a few months earlier when he turned 18 in March and went from his mother's house to his uncle's to his father's in Randolph. Although he was supposed to be working, he wasn't and didn't have a job, but had just passed the GED test. So after emailing and messaging back and forth for a couple of hours, Jennifer went next door at around 2 a.m., while her parents were asleep and while almost everyone in the Zarate home was thought to be asleep as well. James, the 14-year-old brother, would later tell police, though, that he was going upstairs to go to bed because Jonathan planned to try to, quote, mess around with Jennifer. He told police that he only heard her voice when she arrived, but that he hadn't seen her. According to Jonathan's later statement, he and Jennifer watched some Family Guy and a little Futurama and kissed a few times, but things changed, he said, when she started to talk about when his brother had bullied her. They got into an argument and he described punching her violently in the face. He told police that he punched her, kicked her, and beat her using the security pole from the sliding glass door. And when he was sure she'd stopped moving, he went upstairs to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her numerous times. Most heinously, however, he admitted to shoving his bandana-wrapped fist down her throat to try to suffocate her. He said he then used that knife to sever the teen's legs below the knees so that he could fit her remains in a steamer trunk for concealment. His brother would later say that he heard several loud thumps throughout the night, but he wasn't concerned and didn't get up. A little while later, at around 5 a.m., Jonathan woke James to help him put the trunk in the back of their father's Jeep Wrangler, and then they both went to bed. They had a busy day ahead of them, with a stepsister's birthday party being held right there at the house, followed by a cousin's quinceañera later. When they woke up at 9:30 a.m., he claimed they got up and had breakfast, then went to their Seventh-day Adventist church with their dad, right around the time that their neighbors next door were getting really frantic. Within just a few hours of their daughter's murder, Jennifer's parents had awoken at 8 a.m. on Saturday to what I'm sure they believed would be an exciting morning. But that excitement turned to dread when they couldn't find their daughter. The family was scheduled to be leaving for a vacation to Pennsylvania that very day. Between 10 and 10:30 a.m., the Parks went around the neighborhood, asking door to door if anyone had seen their daughter, which no one had. A neighbor who'd come out to help search later testified that she knocked on the Zarate's front door and asked for the dad, but James came to the door. When she told him that Jennifer was missing, he was calm, she said, even cold to her. Jennifer Parks was reported missing at 11:45 a.m., while her body was hidden next door in the trunk of the Zarate father's Jeep. At some point on Saturday, officers questioned them and were told that the brothers hadn't seen Jennifer Parks that day. They then attended the quinceañera at a hotel at nearby Florham Park, and as midnight approached and Saturday turned to Sunday, they waited for their dad to pick them up. And that's when 14-year-old James told police that his 18-year-old brother Jonathan admitted to beating Jennifer to death. Soon after they got home, the pair climbed back into the Jeep and drove with the body of Jennifer Parks to pick up their friend Vladimir in Clifton, New Jersey, around 2:30 a.m. The three drove to the Union Avenue Bridge and attempted to heave the footlocker into the Passaic River, but as James and their friend held it on the bridge, they were spotted. Patrolman Ulrich would later testify that he and Sergeant Amadeo leapt from their cruisers and drew their weapons, ordering the teens to freeze, but they instead dropped the footlocker and took off running back to the Jeep. The officer testified that he struggled with the older brother and got the keys away from him and was able to see flannel fabric and human skin through a gap in the footlocker, finding most of her body when they opened it. The officer said that the trunk smelled rancid and that a substance consistent with blood was visible inside. The trio was arrested, and the following day, 18-year-old Jonathan Zarate was charged with murder, weapons possession, illegally disposing of human remains, employing juveniles in the commission of a crime, and conspiracy to hinder apprehension. He was held on $1 million bail. His 14-year-old brother and their friend Vladimir were charged with a juvenile offense of conspiracy to hinder prosecution and with illegally disposing of human remains. They pleaded not guilty and were sent to the Morris County Juvenile Detention Center. The older brother's defense attorney stated after they were arraigned that, quote, "The Zarate family is just devastated. Imagine having two of your kids sent to jail on the same day." Morris County prosecutor Michael M. Rubinaccio said that, quote, "This wasn't a boyfriend-girlfriend situation, calling it instead, quote, a pure act of murder." He went on to state that the investigation thus far indicated that neither juvenile suspect seemed to be involved in Jennifer's murder. However, both knew that her body was in the footlocker they were trying to throw into the river. Jennifer's autopsy concluded that she died a truly horrible death. She'd sustained blunt force-inflicted injuries to the face and body, stabs to the neck, and a bandana had been stuffed into her throat to stifle her screams. She was determined to have been punched, beaten, and kicked so forcefully in the gut that she vomited and choked to death. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The three were arrested and questioned, and the older Zarate brother allegedly first told police that he went to meet Jennifer outside and found her dead. He gave roughly 6 versions of the story, but none named his younger brother as his accomplice to murder. Those who knew 18-year-old Jonathan when he went to school by his mom's house remembered following his arrest that he was quick to anger and that he would be scary. He wasn't known to have any friends at school or converse with his classmates, who recalled his constant defiance towards teachers. He was known to talk about his love of getting into fistfights since he was in elementary school. The prosecutor, who had at first stated that Jonathan had simply invited Jennifer over and then they argued, a few days later stated that, quote, "My opinion is he lured her over to the residence for the purpose of committing a homicide. I don't have to prove the motive, just that he purposely and knowingly caused her death." Speculation brewed that this change was tailored to more closely fit the intent required to build a death penalty case. Jonathan Zarate's attorney was already hinting that a diminished capacity or insanity defense could be utilized, telling the press that, quote, "He apparently inflicted these injuries. He remembers some things, but not everything. From what I've learned," he told prosecutors, without the benefit of a lawyer present, he was in an uncontrollable rage. "I ask, how bad was it? Is there a defense there? Is he really going to lure someone over when there's witnesses in the house? There was nothing going on that you can point to say they were fighting or something happened between the two of them." 3 days after the murder, the younger brother retained counsel, who told the press that, quote, "There was no ongoing dispute between them." About the statement his client made to police, he said that it, quote, "does not implicate him in the murder or dismemberment," adding that the 14-year-old had no knowledge of the attack until Jennifer's body was already in the steamer trunk. He didn't petition for the teen to be released to his mother, but instead stated that given the emotional impact Jennifer's death had on the community, juvenile detention was, quote, "the safest place for him to be. This case has horrible facts that might lead someone to do something." Over the course of August 2005, the younger Zarate turned 15 in custody, and DNA was collected from him to determine if he matched any samples taken from Jennifer's body. The prosecutor was trying to see if he'd helped his brother kill Jennifer. The Morris County Prosecutor's Office was now officially handling both the murder and the disposal of human remains charges, even though the bridge was in another county. They had until the beginning of October 2005 to decide if the 2 minors would be prosecuted as adults, and notified them that they'd filed the waivers to do so on September 30th, with the prosecutor stating that, quote, "Under the circumstances, I feel it's appropriate." Jennifer's mother's response was, quote, "They committed an adult crime. Kids don't kill kids." She'd previously made it clear that she was fully in support of the death penalty for her daughter's murderer. The older brother's attorney said that, quote, "The juveniles were not involved in the homicide. Whatever their involvement was, it was after the fact. He didn't kill the girl. He helped his brother get rid of the body. My client does not dispute he is responsible for this girl's death. There's no need for the prosecutor's office to be doing this. Disposing of human remains is not a waivable offense." In mid-November 2005, about 3.5 months following the murder, the Zarate brothers' friend Vladimir pleaded guilty to conspiracy to hindering the apprehension and unlawful tampering with human remains, telling the court that he only learned of the body in the footlocker after they were already driving to the bridge. He was released to his parents, and it was announced that he'd probably testify for the state. Just weeks later, in early December 2005, 15-year-old James Zarate's charges were upgraded to murder, with prosecutors alleging that he helped his older brother kill their neighbor. His attorney blamed Vladimir, whose statements prosecutors admitted helped make their decision, adding that only DNA on Jennifer's body would link James to her murder. At a probable cause hearing held on December 7, 2005, prosecutors read from the statement they'd collected from Vladimir on September 30th, now on its third iteration of his story. He had first told police that he said that Jonathan had messaged Jennifer to come over that night, and that James was hiding in the basement closet with a knife when she arrived. An argument about the old brick-throwing incident began, and Jonathan began, quote, beating and choking her. He stated that James, who was, quote, in the closet, jumped out and started stabbing her, and that each brother severed one of the girl's legs, saying that James had told him that blood had squirted when they first tried to cut her leg off at the thigh. That attempt failed, but each leg was cut off below the knee and placed in garbage bags along with paper towels used to clean up the scene and various other items. Vladimir described how he went with the brothers only after they'd come looking for his older brother, who wasn't home, and was initially told that the foul-smelling footlocker contained trash. The prosecutor also told the judge that DNA belonging to the younger brother was found on a discarded piece of chewing gum in one of the garbage bags they planned to toss into the river. James's defense attorney was outraged, claiming that Vladimir had, quote, made this statement for one reason, to get out of jail, and stressed that James's brother's confession did not name him as an accomplice to Jennifer's murder. Regarding the DNA, he said that the gum, quote, could have been swept up off the floor at any time and placed in the plastic bag. It doesn't put my client at the scene of the murder. By now, we all know that reducing stress and maintaining a sense of mental well-being are integral components to a long and happy life. But do we always know what to do about it? I never really did until I started using NOOM Mood, and it's turned me into a huge believer that it's never too late to be in control of your day. NOOM Mood is backed by science and provides you with small daily lessons to teach you about your relationship with stress and anxiety, and get you on the path to mental wellness. The program is both accessible and convenient, laid out in daily 10-minute sessions that you can do anytime, anywhere. I'm filling my toolbox with valuable tools, and I'm loving logging my mood each day because before, I never took stock of my mood unless I was in a bad one. You control your mood and how stress affects you, not the other way around. And NOOM Mood offers a work-at-your-own-pace program complete with a coach to help you along the way. The behavior change experts at NOOM have helped millions through their weight loss program, so rest assured that they can help you address your stress just as well. Worry less and feel happier. Sign up for your trial at noom.com/warbaby. That's NOOM.com/warbaby. Jonathan Zarate spent December of 2005 and January of 2006 being evaluated in Trenton, New Jersey at the Anne Klein Forensic Center after using the bathroom on the floor of his cell in 2 separate incidents of attacking a corrections officer. He was sent back to the Morris County Jail on February 2, 2006 after being deemed, quote, stable. It only took a few weeks before his defense attorney filed a motion to move him to another jail, citing an intent to sue the county that he filed regarding his client's treatment in the jail, saying that, quote, he was not getting the treatment he needs there. While I pass no judgment on the Morris County people, there were 2 incidents there. It's best for everyone that custody be changed. He was moved to the Essex County Jail in Passaic, New Jersey within weeks. In June 2006, the judge determined that 15-year-old James Zarate would be tried as an adult and his name was made public. The judge declared that, quote, this was a horrific crime and I can only imagine how the family must feel. It is in the interest of the public that it requires a trial as an adult, adding that, quote, I do not see this case at all having rehabilitative aspects. The younger brother was now facing a sentence of 30 years to life. Jennifer's mother said in court, quote, "With all that was taken so hideously from us, the murder, the dismemberment of Jennifer, the false statements, the lies, and the lack of regret should all be more than enough to warrant having him waived up to adult status. Our loss is complete. We only had one child." 15-year-old James Zarate was arraigned on the new murder charge and removed from the Morris County Juvenile Detention Center on June 22, 2006. He was placed in his brother's old home, the Morris County Jail, in segregation, held on $1 million bond. Just a few days prior, his older brother Jonathan was again sent for observation to the Anne Klein Forensic Center, this time from the Passaic County Jail. All 4 times Jonathan was sent to Anne Klein, he was determined to have been faking. 6 months passed before the brothers were formally indicted by a grand jury in January 2007 on charges of murder, possession of the knife and metal rod for an unlawful purpose, hindering apprehension or prosecution, and disturbing or desecrating human remains. And Jonathan was also charged with using a juvenile to commit a crime. The state decided not to ask the grand jury to consider the death penalty because they didn't think they could get it, with the prosecutor's office stating that, quote, "It was determined that none of the aggravating factors were met." Zarate's attorney was relieved, saying that, quote, "He has real psychiatric issues. He continues to be heavily medicated." 3 months later, his attorney committed to the insanity defense in court, stating that his client had exhibited anger issues and had a history of antisocial behavior. In contrast, his younger brother's attorney told the judge, quote, "I'm not relying on a psychological defense. As it stands now, I'm preparing to go to trial. My client has expressed his innocence." In February, the older Zarate's psychological evaluation was finally complete after having an original deadline of September 2007, and the report was submitted to the court that the defense said showed evidence of diminished capacity. They were abandoning the insanity defense in pursuit of something they felt they could prove. A few weeks later, the state hired their own expert to evaluate Jonathan, which they could only do after they'd received the defense's report, and that expert ultimately deemed him free of mental defect that could be used as a defense. In April 2008, he got a new lawyer, and it was revealed in court that the state had numerous witnesses from jail who would testify that Jonathan Zarate said he was faking diminished capacity, and a few weeks after that, his new lawyer tried to get a delay so that a new psychiatrist had time to consult a new toxicologist. Zarate was now saying that he was suffering from the adverse effects of long-time PCP and marijuana use. The prosecution pointed out that he had no history of substance abuse issues. The defense tried for a change of venue due to alleged anti-Hispanic rhetoric in the community but was denied, and tried to suppress Zarate's various confessions but was also denied. A week of jury selection began on November 13, 2008, kicking off Zarate's murder trial, during which time the jury saw the steamer trunk, the sliding door security rod, and the bloody basement carpet, in addition to other evidence. In his opening statements on November 25, 2008, Assistant Prosecutor Robert Lane said, quote, "The evidence will show that Jonathan Zarate acted with knowledge and purpose. After he killed her, he made a conscious decision to get rid of the body. The motive is that Jennifer Parks had the audacity to insult his brother. Mere words provoked him to violence with a 16-year-old girl, and as a result, he made the decision to use violence against her." The defense tried in their opening to convince the jury that when he killed Jennifer Parks, quote, "the defense believes that Jonathan Zarate was not a reasonable or rational person," adding that he was, quote, "an individual who at the time did not have the necessary ingredient to be responsible." This case is about troubling facts. It's also about assessing a very troubled individual, a very sick individual. The trial played out as you'd expect. The prosecution said Zarate had no mental defect and that according to Vladimir, his younger brother was his accomplice to murder, while the defense alleged that he was psychotic, suffering from drug toxicity, and that he'd always maintained that he'd killed Jennifer Parks single-handedly. The experts clashed. The prosecution accused the defense's psychiatrist of being duped, and the state's expert had to concede that Zarate had scored in the psychotic range on a psychiatric test, though he maintained that his overall determination was that the accused killer was not actively psychotic at the time of the murder. An officer who was present at the bridge that night took the stand, as did Jennifer's mother and the Zarate brothers' parents, who said that Jonathan had been a well-adjusted boy until their divorce when he was 10, but developed long-lasting aversions to touching everyday objects like the toilet. They described in great detail how he apparently would use the bathroom in his clothes, then refuse to touch them again or clean up the mess. They said he would then stay in the shower for 1 to 2 hours. At other times, his mother said he would stare into space in silence or pace the floor at night. In response to these stories and their relation to the murder of Jennifer Parks, the state's expert said, quote, "When he was doing what he was doing, he wasn't driven by an urge to defecate." Both experts did determine, though, that Zarate did use drugs and did suffer from antisocial personality disorder. In the end, the jury deliberated for a mere 2 hours before finding Jonathan Zarate guilty, deciding that he knew what he was doing the night Jennifer was murdered, and at his sentencing the following month, he received a sentence of life plus 24 years in prison. The life sentence is tantamount to 75 years in New Jersey, of which Zarate is required to complete 85% or 63 years. The additional sentence of 24 years plus credit for time served meant that Zarate won't be eligible for release until he lives past the age of 100. The judge told him at sentencing that, quote, "I can only conclude that you are an evil, vile, despicable killer. Someone who took advantage of a defenseless and at the time a confused and disillusioned child. To butcher another human being in your own home, it's incomprehensible to me that you could party afterwards. He treated this girl like garbage. He couldn't care less. He'd do it again if he could." The elder Zarate brother also had 2 assault charges pending from his attacks on those corrections officers in 2005, which ended up adding 5 years to his sentence. He tried to plead that he'd been struck first, saying at his sentencing hearing that, quote, "I wasn't a model inmate. This is not a shot at all cops. It should be known that these individuals aren't perfect individuals." Although the presumed main perpetrator had already been sentenced, as had the brother's accomplice, the trial of James Carl Zarate still loomed in Jennifer's family's future, and as his June trial date approached, his friend who had turned on him had a great deal to say about the murder. Jury selection began on June 1st, 2009, when James Zarate was 18 years old. The state was alleging that the then 14-year-old despised Jennifer Parks because she'd reported him for bullying, and prosecutors were contending, based solely on Vladimir's statements, that the Zarate brothers plotted and planned to kill the neighbor girl. The defense wanted the friend barred from testifying and denied that revenge was the motive, contending that his client didn't even know about the murder until after it had taken place. The most explosive and controversial testimony, however, besides Vladimir's, came from the medical examiner who did the autopsy, who took the stand and said that the evidence indicated that Jennifer Parks was attacked from the front and the back simultaneously. The now retired ME testified that, quote, "There had to be 2 individuals simultaneously attacking her, but on cross-examination had to admit that this wasn't the only plausible scenario." He had to agree that, while Vladimir specifically mentioned that blood had squirted when they tried to amputate one leg at the thigh, he hadn't noted this in the autopsy, but admitted it was true now. He said that he'd reached these new conclusions only the previous year and had made the determination regarding the thigh cut from an autopsy photograph due to a hematoma present around the cut indicating that she was alive when it occurred. Jurors were read Zarate's early statements where he admitted that he'd helped try to dispose of the steamer trunk and that Jonathan had killed Jennifer while he was upstairs asleep. But when Vladimir took the stand, he maintained the opposite, saying that James had excitedly described to him how he jumped out of the closet and, quote, did most of the killing, claiming for the first time that Jonathan had restrained Jennifer while James beat her up. The defense took notice and forced him to acknowledge that he'd never mentioned that detail before. The self-professed former gang member said that his third statement was the most truthful one and that he'd lied for two reasons because, quote, I didn't want to get involved in a murder or a conspiracy and Jonathan had said he'd take the blame on him. He also maintained in one of those statements that, quote, the Zarate brothers had been arguing between themselves and Jonathan told James he didn't have the guts to kill someone else. Testimony on the DNA evidence revealed that the piece of gum actually had two people's DNA on it, one of them being James Zarate's. He didn't take the stand in his own defense. Each side delivered closing arguments to the jury that totaled 4 hours in length on June 24, 2009, and the jury began deliberations after 3 hours of legal instruction from the judge. The prosecutor said in his closing how coincidental it was that the first time Jennifer and James saw each other since he moved, she ended up dead, adding that, quote, he got her. He got even. Brutality of this nature, savagery of this nature, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. This case does not rise and fall with Vladimir at all. There's so much more. The following day, 2 days before what would have been Jennifer Park's 20th birthday, James Carl Zarate was found guilty of participating in both the murder of Jennifer Parks and the attempted disposal of her body. It took the jury 7 hours to reach their decision. When he was sentenced on July 31, 2009, 5 years and 1 day since Jennifer's murder, Zarate spoke for about 15 minutes, mentioning that one of their own grandparents had been murdered. He told the court, quote, I'd like to apologize for the part of the crime I did commit, but I'm innocent of murder. Whether you accept that is between you and God. I understand completely why you would have hatred for me, my brother, my family. At the end of it all, it's tragic for both families. The judge said when sentencing him that, quote, you tell me that your brother made you do it. You say your attorney messed up. But you have said nothing about your conduct regarding Jennifer Parks. Your conduct was merciless, unfathomable, and savage, adding that this was, quote, something that will not be tolerated in a free society. He was sentenced to life in prison, equating to having to serve 85% of 75 years in prison before he could reach parole eligibility, minus time served. A 2014 appeals court decision resulted in Zarate's 5-year consecutive sentence being dropped. The judge refused, however, to reduce the life sentence because while the state court of appeals stated that his resentencing should look at whether Zarate was, quote, substantially influenced by another person more mature, the judge determined that James Zarate, not his older brother, had motive to commit the murder. In early 2017, Zarate tried to get his waiver to adult court voided retroactively based on a recent decision banning juveniles younger than 15 from being tried as adults. He was denied. But in late 2017, when he was 27, James Zarate was resentenced based on the decision in the State v. Ricky Zuber case, which determined that juvenile offenders tried as adults must be given a meaningful opportunity to be paroled. They set the new minimum sentence for such offenders at 30 years, meaning Zarate would now be eligible for parole at 57 years of age instead of at 78. In September 2021, it was reported that the now 33-year-old was going by the name of King Samurai in prison and was charged with first-degree gang criminality and second-degree crime conspiracy. Regarding his case, though, Zarate appealed to the New Jersey Supreme Court, along with a juvenile offender from a different case named Comer, arguing that even a minimum sentence of 30 years was too high, and the court agreed in January 2022. In a landmark ruling, the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that the two of them and those in similar situations can now request a review of their sentence after 20 years, eliminating the Zuber decision's previous minimum sentence of 30 years. The public defender who argued the case before the High Court said that, quote, the Comer opinion really establishes the power of redemption as it applies to children. And perhaps more importantly, the Comer opinion reaffirms the U.S. and New Jersey Supreme Court precedent that says children are constitutionally different and cannot be put in the same boat as mature adults. Zarate, along with roughly 60 other juveniles in New Jersey, are currently affected by the decision, and 14 states in all have now restructured their juvenile sentencing laws in response to Miller v. Alabama. In around 3 years, in 2025, James Zarate can petition to be released. Jennifer Parks's parents, who moved from the father's childhood home soon after her murder and eventually split, mentioned several times that they'd never be able to forget or to forgive the Zarate brothers for murdering their only child, but one person they did forgive was Vladimir. They were there when he was sentenced in late June 2009, asking the judge to forego any further punishment on his behalf and not even give him probation. The judge gave him 1 year of probation, saying that though it was wrong for him to have been on the bridge, quote, by coming forward, he went a long way to righting that wrong.